Hello and welcome to the Best Practices Summit. Pollinator-Friendly Alliance is a grassroots 501c3 nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of pollinators. Our co-host is the Xerces Society, a science-based nonprofit.
So as many of you may know, systemics are pesticides that get absorbed by plants and then spread inside the plant to other tissues. And all kinds of pesticides are systemic, including many fungicides and herbicides. A well-known example is glyphosate, better known as Roundup. I think Emily may have mentioned that. But today we're going to focus on systemic insecticides and their ecological risks. So the Xerces Society is a nonprofit conservation organization, as many of you also know. We work to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. I recently discovered that insects comprise 59% of identified species. So they're a pretty important group. They are animals without backbones, invertebrates, and they are completely essential to our world. They provide not only pollination services, as we all know, but decomposition, nutrient cycling, the natural pest control. And so if we want flowers, birds, mammals, food, clean water, we need insects and other invertebrates. We partner with a really wide variety of organizations. We could not do our work without them, as well as our members and donors. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who supports our work. So today, we're going to do a little bit of intro to help explain how systemic insecticides work. And then we're going to talk about the ecological risks of systemic insecticides. Sarah will talk about where we're finding them in the environment. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about how you can find bee-safe plants. And the resources are going to be sort of sprinkled throughout our presentation. You'll see when we mention those. So I'm going to dive right in and have you imagine a scenario. Let's say a local landscaping company has a person out spraying weed killer in your yard. And of course, she's aiming for the weeds, but could she get exposed too by getting the herbicide on her skin? Yes. By consuming food or water that got sprayed by mistake? Yes. Especially if she were to eat or drink before washing. Or by breathing it in? Yes. So these exposure routes, contact, oral, and respiration, are also the same ways in which wildlife can be exposed. So with that, let's look at systemic insecticides. These kinds of insecticides, because they make their way inside plants, are designed to kill sucking or chewing insects like aphids, seen on the right, caterpillars, or true bugs, the kinds of things that have piercing, sucking mouth parts. I think Sarah Foltz-Jordan mentioned those earlier. You can see that on this aphid picture here. And any other insects that feed on plant tissue can be exposed as well. Now, because systemics they're inside the plant, they don't get washed off by the rain. And insects don't have to be present when the pesticide is applied. They can hatch out or arrive on the scene later and still receive a toxic dose. Now, plants have tubes to move water and nutrients around, just like we have arteries and veins. They're a little bit different. It's called xylem and phloem. And most systemic insecticides on the market today move upwards toward plant tips inside the xylem tubes, represented on the left. Can you see my mouse here? Maybe not. Okay, but represented with the red on the left and with these red arrows on the plant diagram here. Xylem tubes transport water and minerals upwards and ultimately to the leaf tips and flowers. Now, phloem is a different kind of tube. The flow can be up or down. The purpose of phloem is to move carbohydrates that are basically made in the leaves and stems, the green parts of the plant, from where they're made to storage organs like roots and seeds. And so phloem mobile insecticides can move either up or down the plant as shown by the blue arrows here. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that the blue arrows go up and down. So I wanted to spend a moment just to talk about how these kinds of pesticides are applied, because I think many of us tend to think that pesticides are always sprayed on, and that's less and less the case. Frequently, these kinds of systemics are applied via less visible ways, some of which may strike you as novel. For example, they can be applied to the soil with a granular. They can also be coated on the outside of seeds before the seeds are planted. They can be poured directly at the base of plants, what is called a drench. They can also be injected, and now I'm on the lower row of photos, injected directly into the xylem with a needle. This is common on woody plants, especially trees. And they can be mixed with water and put directly into an irrigation system. They call this chemigation, or sprayed on the trunks of trees. And finally, xylem-mobile pesticides can also get applied as sprays where they can kill insects directly through contact and may still be uptaken through the leaves to result in later toxic exposure through feeding. So note that many of these methods involve application through the soil. And so soil residues may represent a continuing source to plants and insects that visit plants. Excuse me, to insects that visit plants. Phloem-mobile pesticides seem to be more typically applied as sprays. Now, there are about 40 different systemic insecticide active ingredients registered in the US today. They are in very widespread use, basically on every kind of site you can imagine. Their use has been rapidly growing, as demonstrated by the Neonics sales chart, as shown in the graph on the right. And Xerces has recently prepared an online searchable data table that can help you query and gather more information about these registered systemic insecticides, such as their toxicity to bees, their persistence, the strength of their systemic activity, and the sites and crops where each systemic insecticide can be legally used. This shows the kind of information that gets returned for each chemical. If you were to search on a single ingredient here, and you can search on multiple if you like, but for cyantraniliprole, the name of one of these, this is the kind of information you would get. I know it's not easy to read here, but please go check it out. You can go to our website and search for the term systemic, and you should end up finding it pretty easily. So systemic insecticides have received a lot of attention for their impacts to bees, but their ecological impacts are more wide-ranging than that. In addition to bees, remember that adult butterflies and moths and other beneficial insects also feed on pollen and nectar. The caterpillar stages of butterflies and moths, such as this monarch caterpillar on this milkweed, are also at risk of picking up systemics through their feeding, since systemics are also present in the leaves. So I'm going to go through a few examples of specific chemicals to illustrate the risks that have been documented. As I mentioned earlier, neonics are the best known of the systemics and have been widely documented to cause damaging effects to bees, including the notorious event like the 2013 Wilsonville bee kill that killed 50,000 bumblebees in a parking lot. Other damaging effects of neonics to bees include reduced reproduction, suppression of the immune system, impaired foraging, and frankly, many other effects that are documented in the scientific literature. The impacts neonics can cause to other insects are less well known to most people, but I want to just go over a couple of them. For example, on the right, you can see this photo of a hemlock tree. Eastern hemlock forests have been suffering from an invasive insect known as the woolly adelgid. To treat it, drenches of a neonic imidacloprid have been used, but these result, unfortunately, not just in impacts to the adelgid, but also in significant losses in abundance and diversity of the normally robust insect community associated with hemlocks. Hemlocks have 300 different insect species associated with them, and there's a dramatic difference in the diversity and abundance of those species after trees were treated with imidacloprid. Aquatic insects such as mayflies, shown here in the middle, are also quite sensitive to neonics. Experimental studies have shown that clothianidin, which is a major neonic used as a seed coating, can result in reduced predator insects in aquatic communities and reduced emergence of wetland insects. So I want to go over just a couple of the systemic insecticides that are less well known, that are not in the neonic family. For example, chlorantraniliprole, it is often advertised as safe for bees. I think people were hopeful when it first came out, but we now know that it is actually lethal to monarch butterfly caterpillars at very low field realistic concentrations in milkweed leaves. That actually showed higher toxicity than the neonics, which was sort of shocking because the neonics are about as toxic as you can get, but this was actually more toxic, at least to monarch caterpillars. Another study noted that chlorantraniliprole had a severe effect on the production of male bees, known as drones, after bumblebees consumed the levels corresponding with recommended rates on the label. And systemic insecticides can also be conveyed through insects that are feeding on the plant, through the honeydew that some insects create or excrete. True bugs, hemipterans, Sarah Fultz-Jordan talked about them a little bit, excrete the substance called honeydew, which is a really interesting substance. It actually is really high in sugars. It's somewhat similar to nectar, and it's actually the most abundant carbohydrate source for beneficial insects, such as pollinators and biological control agents, the natural ones that are in ecosystems. So understanding this exposure route is really important as well, and it's not something that's been given a lot of attention. There were two recent studies recently. Two of the newer systemic insecticides called Flonicamid and Pymetrizone. Oh, wait a minute, I think I misspelled that. It's Pymetrizone. Both of them are recommended as so-called reduced risk pesticides. Well, they were present in honeydew that was excreted by mealybugs that were on plants that had been treated with these systemic insecticides. And the mealybug honeydew then increased the mortality of hoverflies, a predator insect, that were consuming the honeydew. And in woody plants, detections of systemic insecticides years after application appears to be especially common. There's a chemical known as emamectin benzoate. It's been widely used in the eastern United States in the last few years against emerald ash borer. And studies have shown that it apparently remains in many species of trees for at least a year after application. And some studies have found residual activity in ash 3 years after application. And it's not the only long-lived persistent systemic. A couple of the neonics have been also found to be extremely persistent in woody plants. Imidacloprid has been found in rhododendron blossoms 3 to 6 years after soil applications, and in eastern hemlock at least 31 months after soil applications. And because of this long-lived phenomenon in trees, systemics are also found in the fallen leaves. And this, for deciduous trees, and this residue can slow down the decomposition of the leaves by earthworms. So I don't want you to walk away thinking that the only bad insecticide is a systemic insecticide. We do see people kind of coming to that conclusion, and it's a little bit erroneous. So I just want to explain why. Non-systemics, such as pyrethroids, can be enormously toxic to a wide range of insect life as well. They don't penetrate plants and move throughout plants, but they are extremely highly toxic on contact. Remember back to that very first slide, the contact exposure. So in looking at the comparison between these, keep in mind that the effect of systemics is compared to contact insecticides or non-systemics is more about the location and the timing of exposure. It's not necessarily that toxicity is higher for systemics than for non-systemics. So in this table, we can look at a couple of comparison areas. So systemics may contaminate the plant, including pollen, nectar, and leaf tissue, which is important foods, from the inside, and non-systemics will only contaminate from the outside. I did say in here, or from the outside when foliar applications are used, because as I talked about, some systemics are applied foliarly or as sprays. Systemics are also often present in plant tissue at lower, steadier concentrations than the kind of surface residues you get from a contact spray. Thus, there's a potential for prolonged chronic exposure. In contrast, the non-systemics, they are basically put on the plant as surface residues, and those surface residues are present at their highest levels immediately after the spray, but concentrations can decline quickly through breakdown in sunlight, air, and water washing the residues off. And then systemics, keep in mind that application during any season may represent a toxic concern for pollinators because of that prolonged uptake. But for non-systemics, it's the bloom time applications when pollinators are present that are of particular concern for pollinators. Of course, if you're concerned about a broader range of species, we're not just looking at pollinators, you're going to want to think beyond bloom time. So now it's time to transition to my colleague, Sarah Hoyle. Take it away, Sarah, and I'll stop showing. Oh no, I'm showing you slides.
Yes, please. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Hoyle. I'm also on the pesticides program at Xerces with Sharon and Emily May. Next slide, please. I'm not seeing my slides advance, Sharon, but so now that Sharon has introduced you to the systemic insecticides and some of the risks that they pose to invertebrates, I'll talk a bit about where we're finding these pesticides on the landscape and how they can affect wildlife. Most of this section is going to focus on neonicotinoids, since researchers have looked for them a lot more often than some of the newer systemics, but we're beginning to see these turn up in samples as well. Next slide, perfect. The first thing I want to mention about where we're seeing systemic insecticides is that they're being used and found in very diverse landscapes. So we're not only seeing these pesticides in agricultural areas, but also in residential and other community landscapes. Many of the application methods for systemic insecticides, especially some of the soil-based methods that Sharon mentioned, can leave long-lived residues in soils where they can then move with water or be taken up by plants growing nearby, sometimes even years after they were applied. So now we'll look at where we're finding some of these systemic insecticides. Next slide, please. So though today's summit is mainly focused on pollinator conservation, I want to take a couple minutes to talk about the impacts of systemic insecticides in waterways in particular. So as Sharon explained, systemic insecticides are designed to move in the vascular system of plants, which means that they move quite readily in water. Since they are so soluble, systemics can move easily away from where they're applied, particularly if they are applied to soils via things like seed treatments, drenches, or some other methods. Once the systemics are in soils, they tend to find their way into surface water and are now found quite commonly in waterways around the country. We're particularly concerned with certain systemic insecticides because so many are highly toxic to aquatic inverts as well as pollinators. So the same pesticides that we hear a lot about for pollinator concerns are also moving into waterways where they can have really devastating impacts on aquatic ecosystems. As Sharon mentioned earlier, some of the critical aquatic species like mayflies and caddisflies are especially sensitive to neonicotinoids at very low levels. Some of these disruptions in aquatic invertebrate populations from pesticides, either alone or in combination with other stressors like water temperature, can in turn impact food availability for birds, fish, and other wildlife that rely on robust populations of aquatic invertebrates. Next slide, please. So we wanted to take a closer look at how often neonics were turning up in Midwestern waters in particular, and reviewed USGS water sampling data collected from 1999 to 2020. This information formed the basis for a fact sheet that we released last summer and was included as a resource for this talk. So you should be able to find on the conference website as well as on the Xerces website. So you'll notice if you look at this table that there are a lot more imidacloprid samples than those for clothianidin and thiamethoxam, about 5,000 versus about 200 for the other two. And this is because imidacloprid has both been in use for quite a bit longer and also been sampled for by USGS for longer. So they began sampling for imidacloprid in 1999, and then clothianidin and thiamethoxam have only been analyzed since about 2012. And I'll also note that while we're focusing on the neonics here, there are quite a few newer systemic insecticides like those that Sharon mentioned that would likely also be turning up in some of these samples, but they're not yet included in the suite of chemicals that USGS and other researchers are regularly looking for in water samples. So when we looked at this USGS data, we found that a neonic was detected in 38 to 62% of the water samples that were taken across the Midwestern states. So given how commonly these pesticides are turning up, we took a look at the compared the level of imidacloprid detections to EPA's chronic aquatic life benchmark. And these aquatic life benchmarks are an indicator of the pesticide concentration where chronic exposures could potentially harm freshwater invertebrates. So they're essentially kind of a concern level that EPA sets to understand how to relate water sampling data to levels that would harm invertebrates. So when we did this, we found that 81% of the USGS samples where imidacloprid was detected actually exceeded this chronic exposure benchmark. So this is really cause for concern because we're seeing quite widespread and frequent exceedances of these chronic invertebrate health benchmarks that really give us a little bit of pause about the health of our aquatic systems and the wildlife that rely on them. Next slide, please. So where are all these neonics coming from, especially in Midwestern waters? Well, we know that the majority of neonic use in the Midwest for agriculture is on seed treatments, especially on corn and soy, which together are planted on about 148 million acres across the Midwestern states, which is an area larger than Minnesota and the Dakotas combined. You can see the extent of seed treatment use illustrated here because USGS publishes pesticide use estimate maps that used to include seed treatment estimates, but no longer do. They stopped estimating seed treatment use after 2014. So what we're seeing here is a map of the 2014 clothianidin estimates. Please click. So you can see the dark colors across the Midwest, indicating the high use of clothianidin in this circle here. So then if we look to the following year, click please. This 2015 map appears to show a really major decline in clothianidin use, but this is only because they removed seed treatments from the estimates. So all those acres that received clothianidin in 2014 are probably actually still being planted with treated seed, but they are not showing up on the newer USGS maps of pesticide use estimates. So since treated seed is still the key use of neonics in the Midwest, it's likely that a lot of the neonics that were found in waterways are actually coming from these seed treatments. Researchers have estimated that only 2 to 20% of the neonics applied to the seed are actually taken up by the growing plant, leaving like 80+% of the neonic in the soil where it's available to leach offsite slowly over time. So this makes insecticide seed treatments a concern not only for pollinator exposure, but also potentially an even greater concern for water quality, which is why we're so worried about their widespread use. Next slide, please. So we've talked about systemics getting into waterways, but of course we're also finding them on plants in the landscape where they can potentially expose pollinators. Some of these plants have taken up systemic pesticides that have moved off-site, and others may have had systemics intentionally applied. Researchers have found harmful levels of systemic insecticides in plants growing in field margins, near contaminated waterways, and where residential applications have been made. We're also finding systemics in nursery plants where consumers are purchasing them for conservation without realizing that they have been treated. Some nurseries have moved away from neonics thanks to public pressure and attention, but we're now starting to see some of the newer systemic insecticides showing up. So we need to really be thinking about all the systemics that have the potential to harm pollinators, not just the neonics. Next slide, please. To better understand pesticide contamination on the landscape, Xerces did a study with some partners at University of Nevada, Reno in 2019, where we sampled milkweed growing across California's Central Valley that has actually been published and was included in the resource link for this talk as well. We found a wide diversity of pesticides in all the landscapes that we sampled, not surprisingly, including quite a few systemic insecticides and some of the newer products. While we don't have specific monarch toxicity data for many of the pesticides we identified, we still found that 32% of our samples exceeded the level that would be toxic to monarch caterpillars. And that, I believe, was based on having toxicity information for monarchs for only, I believe, 4 pesticides. So just those 4 pesticides drove monarch caterpillar toxicity across 32% of our samples, which is quite concerning. And these toxic samples were due to contamination from the neonicotinoids and chlorantraniliprole, which Sharon mentioned in particular, which are all systemic insecticides. So we're really seeing this concern on the landscape of systemic insecticide contamination. During this project, while it was mostly focused on plants growing on the landscape in different areas, we also included a couple of samples of milkweed from nursery plants. And those samples, combined with the general contamination that we saw across the landscapes, made us curious about what we might find in other milkweed plants purchased from retail nurseries. Next slide, please. So to answer that question, last year we collected samples of milkweed plants with help from Xerces staff and volunteers across the country from retail nurseries across 15 states and had those analyzed for pesticide residues. We found at least 2 pesticides and up to 28 with an average of 12 in each milkweed plant we sampled. Native milkweed species were no less contaminated than tropical milkweed, and there are not many trends that explain the variation in our data. So this shows us that pesticide residues seem to be pretty common and widespread in nursery plants. In terms of toxicity in these samples, we found that 20% of the samples exceeded levels that are toxic to lepidopterans due to contamination from 5 different pesticides, 4 of which are systemic insecticides. So once again, we're seeing that the systemic insecticides can drive toxicity to pollinators. We also saw quite a few fungicide concentrations that exceeded levels shown to have sublethal impacts on monarchs, which is another cause for concern since there's so much less research on fungicides than insecticides, and we don't know as much about their impacts. So we're currently writing up our findings from this study and hope to have them published soon. So keep an eye out for more details coming this spring or summer. But overall, our findings really highlight the importance of reaching out to nurseries and asking questions about the plants that you're purchasing. So I'll hand it back over to Sharon now, who will talk more about how to find these Be Safe plants.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That was really interesting, especially all that data. I was just shaking my head on some of that. Well, we are pretty sure, I'm sure that a lot of you in the audience are trying to do the right thing, buying organic food whenever you can, planting pollinator gardens, and avoiding use of pesticides. Going to the nursery is just such a wonderful spring ritual or fall ritual, but you know, as Sarah mentioned, we do have a lot of concerns about how many pesticides, systemics in particular, are showing up on plants that you buy at the nursery. So we want to leave you with a few details about how you can also help by seeking out Be Safe plants when you buy them. My computer's a little slow for some reason, and it's not advancing. Well, I'm going to just keep talking here. So why is this important? Well, nursery use of pesticides can be risky for pollinators. And from studies in the scientific literature, we see indicators of risk, including that studies show lots of pesticides in and on nursery ornamentals, typically multiple pesticides at once. This was verified once again with the recent milkweed study, as Sarah mentioned. And sometimes those residue loads do reach levels able to kill bees. And then pesticides applied during bloom, whether they're systemic or not in nurseries, do also create a big problem, potentially exposing the bees directly and resulting in high residue levels in pollen. And applications of systemics, even weeks before bloom, can result in high residues. I'm sorry, my computer's, there we go, finally responding. And then woody plants, as I mentioned earlier, shrubs and trees can express systemic pesticides for months to years after an application. So to find the safest plants possible, Xerces recommends that you make clear to your nurseries an overriding ask or principle. I want plants free of pesticides that could be harmful to bees, monarchs, and other pollinators. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit because I know some of you have been asking for these, and it can be a little bit frustrating, the responses that you get. But the more of us that are asking, and the more often that we all ask, the more likely ultimately that we'll be able to turn this ship around. So making this statement once is not as impactful saying it each time you visit a nursery, even if you go back to the nursery multiple times in the same season. The more nursery managers hear it, the more they will pay attention. But don't stop there just by making the ask. It's important to then engage more deeply and ask the nursery questions about how the plants they're offering were grown. So you can start out by asking if they have organic milkweed or nectar plants or pollinator plants. Ask them to guide you to the organic plants and seeds. And if they can't offer you organics, and we know that these are hard to find outside of vegetable starts, ask them if they have plants that have been grown without neonics and other similar systemic insecticides. And then third, and especially if they don't have neonic-free plants or organic plants, or if they don't know, ask them what steps their nursery and their suppliers take to offer plants grown using pollinator-friendly pest management. I'll talk about that more in the next slide, but before I move on, this slide shows a postcard that we have available, the simple steps for buying Be Safe plants. Emily May designed it. You just may have seen her presentation. And if you're interested in copies of these to distribute to, members of your organization, friends, family, or people in your community, please contact us. Our email will be on the last slide. And although we use the phrase be safe, these guidance documents in this postcard will also help you find plants safe for pollinators, for butterflies too, and other pollinators. So that last number 3 step, what do we mean by that? Finding nurseries practicing pollinator-friendly management. Well, 3 main things. 1, prevention of pests through non-chemical means, monitoring or scouting, and limiting pesticide harm. Nurseries that practice these 3 principles together can greatly reduce their reliance on harmful pesticides. Now, we have a webinar that we put together about a year ago that goes into a lot more detail on these particular practices and examples of how nurseries are putting these into place. If you want to go deeper and understand that, as well as coaching on how to talk to your nursery in a way that they will be more receptive to you. We have like a little skit in there that's a lot of fun to watch. We really encourage you to go watch that webinar. It's at our YouTube channel, and I think we may be able to put that into the Q&A so that you all can see that link. We've also summarized these recommendations and provided more information in our new fact sheet, Buying Be Safe Plants, and we go into more detail for the benefits specifically of nurseries themselves in the Offering Be Safe Plants, a guide for nurseries document that you see on the right. And both of these are on our website. So please take the time to use this information to talk to your nurseries. You can leave the second fact sheet with the nurseries when you visit so that they can look at their practices against these measures and recommendations. And let's see.
Sharon, I think all of those resources also are on the link on the summit page. So are you ready for some questions?
We are, and thank you. It's been such a pleasure to be here. And for those of you who want any more information about anything we just shared, after the summit is over, we're happy to talk with you anytime. Just contact us at the Pesticides@xerces.org site. And we are a donor-supported nonprofit, and we appreciate all of our members. So